The sons of Fenris. They are forged in the crucible of their unforgiving world. Driven by a relentless thirst for battle and glory, these gray-clad warriors, resembling the primal wolves of old, find their greatest satisfaction in the clash of steel amidst the chaos of war. The Space Wolves are known in their native tongue of Juvik as Vaika Fenrika, or the Wolves of Fenris, and they are amongst the first founding Space Marine legions. At their helm once stood the legendary Primarch Leman Russ, raised to glory by the Emperor himself during the early stages of the Great Crusade. Initially, they were known as the 6th Legion of the Astartes. The Space Wolves are a celebrated chapter, in large part due to their fierce independence and their constant defiance of authority, which has saved the lives of many Imperial citizens. These traits were essential and greatly mirror the brutal and untamed cultures that developed on their homeworld of Fenris. Unlike other chapters, they boldly deviate from the Adeptus Astartes' own codex in their structure and organization, maintaining the traditions of the times of the legions, setting themselves apart from their brethren. In large part, this is due to their near inability to create successor chapters. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium underwent significant restructuring, and for the Space Marines, this was known as the Second Founding, which led to the division of the Space Wolves into two distinct chapters. The Space Wolves, who continued to follow their own path in defiance of the Codex Astartes, and the newly named Wolf Brothers. However, the latter faced severe challenges due to rampant gene seed mutations, leading to their eventual disbandment. However, now with the advent of the Era Indomitus, new successors of the Space Wolves have emerged. Yet some amount of tension within the chapter proper still remains regarding these Primaris Marines, warriors who, although are created through the genetic legacy of Leman Russ himself, seem to be starkly different from the Wolves of Fenris, at times even referred to as being too similar to the sons of Guilliman to be true sons of Russ. Many veterans of the Space Wolves question the legitimacy of these newcomers, to the point that they even question if they are actually the sons of the revered Primarch. Nevertheless, the Great Wolf Logan Grimnar has welcomed them and acknowledged their worth as warriors of the Wolf King's lineage. Throughout the millennia, the Space Wolves have fought with unwavering ferocity in the name of the Emperor and the Imperium, as they currently stand as one of the most renowned Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Their deeds and sagas have resounded across the galaxy through both space and time, which has led to many both loyal members of the Imperium and those who exist without the Emperor's grace to know them for their fierce temperament and their strong preference for close quarters combat. They are renowned to be as stubborn as they are deadly, as these warriors are ever eager to etch their names into the records of war. And so the legends of the Space Wolves have been woven across countless worlds, capturing the imagination of a myriad of Imperial citizens. Their battle honors are so vast and numerous that a single battle scribe would need a lifetime to record them all. Unlike other chapters, the Space Wolves celebrate their victories in a rather unique way, crafting their sagas and tales of valor to be passed down through generations, primarily orally. Their stories are not just records of battles won, but living testaments to the indomitable spirit of the Wolves of Fenris. And so the Space Wolves are a proud and fierce chapter, often driven by an insatiable thirst for glory in all their endeavors. Amongst their fellow Astartes, particularly the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves are perceived as often being overly boastful and rather vainglorious, their methods being seen as too crude, and their desire for renown too excessive for a proper Astartes. However, records have shown that the truth runs deeper. Every Space Wolf aspires for his saga, his personal tale of valor and heroism, to be retold by his brethren long after his death. They wish for their names to be uttered with the same reverence as some hold for their Primarch, Leman Russ. However, something that has often gotten them into bad ways with the Imperium at large is the Space Wolves' active defiance of the Codex Astartes, representing one of the Imperium's most profound deviations from the doctrines of the Codex Astartes, from the doctrines of the Adeptus Astartes. However, this is largely waved away due to the genetic heritage derived from Leman Russ being in essence a double-edged sword, endowing them with a Primarch's keen senses, but also subjecting them to the constant threat of fierce fearsome mutations known as a curse of the Wulfen. This curse can transform warriors into monstrous bestial forms, a dire fate for any son of Fenris. And it is also believed that originally there were no wolves or canines on Fenris, and that those that currently exist on Fenris are just brothers who had fallen to the Wulfen curse, more drastically than others. Organizationally, the chapter pays little heed to the Codex Astartes, holding fast to the traditional structures and practices that saw them through the climactic battle of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Visually, the Space Wolves are considered to be one of the more distinct chapters in the Imperium, their armor being a patchwork of intricately crafted talismans, trophies, animal skins, bones, you name it. If they vanquish it in combat, it's most certainly going to have some part of it attached to their armor eventually. However, despite being renowned for their fierce independence, they are incredibly loyal to their packs, which in essence is the Space Wolves term for their Space Marine squads. Every deed a Space Wolf undertakes, every time their squad, or rather their pack, survives, is another verse in their ever ongoing saga, which are not just filled with their triumphs, but also with their failures and their tribulations. Many consider the Space Wolves' rites of initiation into the chapter to be amongst the hardest of any Space Marine chapter. To be accepted as a neophyte, a Space Wolf must face a battle of almost certain death, vanquishing a particular foe, one of the legendary beasts from their planet of Fenris, by themselves. It is only then, if his deeds are worthy, that he will be chosen by the chooser of the slain. In essence, something akin to a Space Marine apothecary, who is said to take them away from their family and begin the induction into their new pack. This marks only the beginning of the journey, and for many, the end point of it, as the gene seed of Leman Russ is so potent that it often overwhelms almost every aspirant, transforming them into the feral creatures known as Wulfen, and or any other manner of wolf-like beast. If they are deemed worthy, they are allowed to advance, as they will continue to face further trials, eventually earning a place amongst the Bloodclaw assault packs. At this stage, a Space Wolf is a brash and reckless warrior, by all accounts, even those of more experienced Space Wolves. But rather than stopping this, their leaders will often stoke this competitive spirit, using the fervor of youth to drive the young wolf of Fenris further and further still into glory. However, time and experience will temper all sons of Russ, eventually crafting them into some of the most elite warriors humanity has ever known, slowly learning to balance their impetuous nature through the wisdom and the sagas of their elders, eventually earning their place amongst the veteran Grey Hunter packs. And thus, the Space Wolves have become renowned across the Imperium and the galaxy itself as some of the most flexible and experienced warriors that the Adeptus Astartes can produce. Under the leadership of their master and their genetic father, Leman Russ, the Space Wolves had carved a bloody path through the stars during the Great Crusade. Despite their fearsome reputation and the independence he and his sons prized, they never strayed far from the shadow of the Emperor, and to many this made them appear as the personal hounds of the Emperor, his lapdogs, if you will. Unlike their brother legions, the Space Wolves were often held back and kept tightly in check by the Imperial court and unleashed almost exclusively at the Emperor's direct commands. As a blunt instrument of retribution, they were often called upon not only to annihilate those who resisted the Imperium's demands for compliance, but also to punish all those who dared question the Emperor's glory or even betray their oaths. This dual role eventually allowed them to become known as the Emperor's executioners, as they were also seemingly responsible, though records of it are obscured to this day, for the slaying of the two missing Space Marine legions. As the long solar decades of war continued, the Space Wolves became increasingly isolated, seen by many as necessary evils and a savage force wielded by the Imperium, not due to desire but due to lack of other options, caused them to gain a rather foul reputation. And by the closing years of the Great Crusade and the ascension of Horus to the rank of War Master, the Space Wolves stood largely apart, a legion respected by some, feared by others, and mistrusted by any of those who were smart enough to be wary of the wolves of Fenris. However, they would maintain both bonds of camaraderie and respect with certain legions. However, for some unknown reason, they seem to hold a particular disdain for certain other legions, a deep-seated animosity that even even the blind could see through. To some, the Space Wolves were and still are seen as little more than controlled beasts, leashed monsters to be released only when killing is to be done, something simultaneously more than human, yet less than any man, perhaps even less than the worst of the Astartes. Yet the Space Wolves were and still remain indifferent to such judgments. They understand the nature of their purpose with unyielding clarity. They were not builders of empires, they were not sentinels guarding the walls, nor were they soldiers marching in lockstep, nor warriors vying for rank and ceremonial honor. They would not even consider themselves statesmen. They were predators, made and molded to be such by the God Emperor himself, and any who dared stand in their path or fall within their reach would face the severe consequences of the wrath of the wolves of Fenris. The Space Wolves, though rather verbose and bombastic, were noted to not be interested in pomp or circumstance of others. They often saw themselves as the storm at the edge of humanity, ever ready to strike with the ferocity of a pack of wolves descending upon its prey. Before the Great Crusade, Terra, the cradle of humanity, endured a long, bleak isolation as the galaxy was engulfed by nigh impenetrable warp storms that surged violently across the stars, creating barriers that cut off Terra from the rest of the humanity's settled worlds. This tumultuous period was known as the Age of Strife, and it was a rather macabre and bleak chapter in humanity's history. Even the Emperor, with all his foresight and power, was trapped upon Terra, unable to reach out to his scattered children across the stars. His efforts would only be confined to securing humanity's birthplace and readying his armies for the monumental task of reclaiming the galaxy. Bereft of the Emperor's guidance during this grim age, the human worlds spread throughout the galaxy were left vulnerable to Xenos depredation and the nightmarish horrors which emerged from the warp. Many fell into anarchy, chaos, and ultimately despair, as humanity, it seems, stood on the precipice of oblivion, its scattered remains doomed to fade away, and the echoes of humanity lost to time. During this period of isolation, the Emperor embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the creation of 20 transhuman beings known as the Primarchs. These Primarchs are the pinnacle of genetic engineering, each created to be a unique being of extraordinary, nigh unparalleled abilities, both physical and, as Jagatai Khan found out, psychic in origin. Though molded after humanity, these beings were far from ordinary men, possessing a strength, a presence, and a power that marked them as something greater, as the Emperor's very own sons. However, the Primarch project, as it came to be known, was dealt a catastrophic blow by the universe's worst mother. While still in their infancies, the Primarch's incubation pods, housed deep within the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, were swept up by a great warp disturbance, which gave the Primarch's mother, Erda, the ability to cast out these nascent superhuman beings into the stars through the very bowels of the warp, hell itself. She literally launched her and the Emperor's children into hell. Faced with this setback, the Emperor chose not to replicate the long and arduous project that had created the Primarchs. Instead, he turned his attention to a new solution, one born from the remnants of his earlier work. Using the genetic foundation laid by the creation of the Primarchs project, the Emperor and his team of exceptionally skilled geneticists crafted a set of specially engineered organs derived from the genomes of each Primarch. These organs, designed for the implantation into early adolescent human males, would transform them into formidable warriors and echoes of the Primarchs, there to be known as Adeptus Astartes, or colloquially as the Space Marines. Thus, through the fire and the flames of adversity, the Great Crusade gained its Space Marines, and especially the Space Wolves, who would prove themselves as the Emperor's mightiest tools, a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to consume humanity. The Space Wolves, apart from all their kin, embodied the fierce, untamed spirit of their Primarch the closest, and even without meeting him would carry his legacy of strength and savagery throughout the galaxy. forever leaving their mark on the Imperium's history. Now, to further understand how the Space Wolves would develop, we have to look into their Primarch and his early history, as the saga of Leman Russ begins on the nigh inhospitable death world of Fenris. Here, amidst the biting cold and the unforgiving landscape, his incubation pod plummeted from the heavens, crashing violently into the side of a vast mountain. The brutal environment of Fenris was one of icy storms and deadly predators, which would have spelled a certain death for any other ordinary being, be they child or adult. Yet the Primarchs were far from ordinary humans, and Leman Russ stood apart from his brothers. Emerging from the wreckage, the infant Primarch first encountered a ferocious mother Thunderwolf, who for most would have been the end. But this child was unlike any other, a being of immense strength and primal ferocity. This caused the mother to, instead of seeing him as a meal, recognizing him as a wild spirit as untamed as herself, leading to her choice not to slay him, but to raise him as one of her cubs amongst her pack. This twist of fate would shift history greatly, leading to many of Leman Russ's characteristics becoming more pronounced, and eventually leading to the Fenrisian tale of the Wolf Child. His earliest days were spent in the company of beasts rather than men, and much of what is known about the origins of the Space Wolves and the tales of Leman Russ would be preserved in these early accounts by Gungrul the Elder, a chronicler and contemporary of the ancient Fenrisian king Thregnir, and his epic work would be known as The Ascension of the Wolf King, which provides a vivid portrayal of a pivotal moment in the Primarch's nascent life, and it goes as follows. During one particular brutal hell winter, when the ice storms at Fenris were at their fiercest, a hunting party of Fenrisian tribesmen stumbled upon the wolf child and his pack. Seeing them as nothing more than beasts, the hunters attacked, slaying the mother wolf and many of her cubs with their spears and arrows. However, they were not prepared for what would happen next. The young Primarch, driven by a ferocious blend of grief, rage, and a deep-seated animosity at seeing his kin slain, fought with an almost supernatural fury, as he tore through the warriors with his bare hands, killing dozens of them in a desperate bid to protect his remaining packmates, Ferric and Gri. His strength was beyond anything the tribesmen had ever encountered on the world of Fenris, and his savage determination left them awestruck. At that critical moment, fate seemed to intervene once more. One amongst the hunters with a keen eye, and perhaps a touch of Fenrisian wisdom, realized that the wild creature was not a wolf, but a child, a human in form, if not entirely in spirit, which led to him calling for his fellow warriors to lower their weapons, and slowly they would heed his plea, which led the bloodied and battered youth, still bristling with aggression, standing his ground, fangs bared and ready to strike, choosing then to stay his own wrath, recognizing that the confrontation was, at least for now, at an end. The hunters, uncertain of what to do next with this extraordinary being and his remaining wolf companions, decided to bring them before King Thregnir of the Russ tribe. The aging king and shrewd leader was known for having a rather discerning eye, and with said eye he saw something in the young Primarch that the others did not, a potential that transcended the ordinary. He would then decree that the wolf child would be taken into his household and raised as one of his own, not merely a ward of the tribe, but as a true Fenrisian, a warrior who was destined for greatness. This was a decision that left many amongst his tribe baffled, as they viewed the boy as nothing more than a wild beast. Yet time would prove the king and his choice to be wise beyond measure, as under his guidance the young Primarch would not only grow in strength, but in skill and in understanding, as he would master what it meant to be a leader, a warrior, and ultimately the Wolf King of Fenris. For the first time in his life, Leman Russ had found himself amongst his own kind, humanity, stripped of the wild and primal existence he had known with the Thunderwolves since the inception of his earliest memories. This led to him quickly adapting to the ways of the Fenrisian people. It seemed, at least to them, that the young Primarch had an uncanny ability to learn and excel, as he swiftly mastered the art of the warrior, becoming adept in wielding the primitive iron axes and swords of the Fenrisian people, demonstrating both a strength and finesse unlike any other, and possessing an infectious laughter and booming voice that could bellow out even the mightiest song, even though he was renowned for being tone deaf in every sense of the word. It quickly became clear to all those who witnessed him that Russ was far more than the feral beast they had initially thought, as he himself slowly began to realize that while more human than wolf, he was superior to both. And this was a realization that not only Russ came about, but those who witnessed him often would come to. This realization, while not lost on others, did not inflate Russ's ego beyond his measure. In one particularly telling episode of his saga, Russ was in a sparring match with the very champion of the King's Guard, and in the sparring match, Russ disarmed his opponent thrice, and instead of pressing on the advantage, he would constantly return the champion's weapons, a gesture that not only demonstrated his unmatched battle prowess, but also his growing and deep understanding of respect and honor. It was in that moment that the king, the ruler of the Russ tribe, silently acknowledged to himself that the young warrior was destined to someday take his place. Russ would then quickly begin to speak in the Fenrisian dialect of Low Gothic, with a commanding eloquence that captivated those who listened to him. One evening, recognizing his exceptional nature and growth, the king bestowed upon him his true name. Rather than the wolf child, he would be known as Leman of the Russ. As Leman Russ matured, he would evolve into an unparalleled warrior, the greatest being within the world of Fenris. His leadership on the battlefield was unmatched, and he led his tribe of warriors to countless victories, 1,000 and more. When the king passed, there was no hesitation in whom would assume the mantle of leadership. Leman of the Russ would ascend to the throne and become the Wolf King at last. His deeds and leadership quickly spread, cementing his reputation as a living legend across the harsh worlds of Fenris. Yet this rise to power and fame would not remain confined to this icy realm, as inevitably news of this extraordinary leader reached the ears of one who had long sought his lost sons, the very emperor of mankind. Unlike many of the other Primarchs, much of what remains of Leman Russ's history is shrouded more in myth and legend than verifiable fact, shaped largely by stories passed down orally through the generations of the Fenrisian tribes. And as time would go on, these tales and feats would become larger than life, to the point that some within the ecclesiarchy would believe these tales have Leman Russ, at least in the hearts and minds of the Fenrisian people, eclipsing even the emperor. It was said by some of the Fenrisian tribes that he could single-handedly turn back entire armies of the king's foes, emerging unscathed from the fiercest battles. It was also claimed that he could uproot massive oak trees with a single hand and break them over his back as if they were mere twigs. Stories spoke of him wrestling the Fenrisian mammoth to the ground and roasting the enormous beasts on large trees to be eaten whole by him for every single meal. Such stories, while grandiose and clearly embellished, solidified his reputation as rightful heir to the planet, leading Leman Russ to take the throne, ruling his world without question. As time unfolded, Leman Russ became fully undisputed as the king of all Fenris, and his reign was marked not only by indomitable strength and martial prowess, but a great wisdom and an unyielding sense of justice, as his judgments were both firm and decisive as his sword arm was, and his authority was unchallenged, as no man nor beast could overcome the Wolf King, and no tribe dared stand against the might of the armies he assembled under his rule, a rule which caused a rare period of peace, brokered between both man and wolf, a truce that was as ferocious as it was fragile, and upheld by his will alone. Russ's court would become a place of both savage beauty and raw power, where only the most formidable warlords across Fenris would be able to gather, and where the fairest maidens sought his favor. The stories of his conquests, in all turns of the phrase, and his deeds would spread like wildfire across the frozen tundras of Fenris, reaching even the most distant corners of his realm. The world's legendary Wolf King, who had risen to unite the fractious warlike tribes of Fenris, did not take long before his legend would reach far beyond the icy world, as upon hearing of these tales, the emperor began his long journey towards Fenris. When the mighty fleets of the God Emperor's Great Crusade drew near to Fenris, they were met with these extraordinary tales of a feral yet brilliant leader who carved an empire from chaos. These accounts were soon identified by the emperor and his scholars, along with many remembrancers, as those matched matching what stories of the long-lost Primarchs existed. What great joy humanity must have felt as one of the Emperor's long-lost and greatest missing sons was found, a powerful being, already a legend in his own right. With this revelation, the Emperor made himself to descend upon Fenris, and it was so that the vast starships of the Imperium stretched across the skies, and to many of those from Fenris, they appeared to be a fleet of silent giants descending upon their quaint icy world. The Emperor's arrival had come just a few short years after Leman Russ had solidified his rule across the planet and forged his kingdom proper, and in those moments, beneath the cold, unyielding skies of Fenris, the destiny of the Wolf King and his place amongst humanity as a whole was about to be realized. A fateful meeting set between the father of mankind and his feral yet mighty son. The beginning of a new chapter in the Great Crusade was about to be written. Moving on, the early history of the 6th Legion, later to be known as the Space Wolves, was largely held in obscurity deliberately. This veil of silence extends to several of the Proto-Legion's formations, which emerged during the latter stages of the Unification Wars on Terra. This secrecy was rather typical of the precautions surrounding the nascent Legiones Astartes, and it was even more pronounced for the 6th Legion and its two sister legions of the 18th Legion, which would then become known as the Salamanders, and the 20th, which was eventually known as the Alpha Legion. This grouping was often referred to as the Trifoil Legions, and were established to function in relative isolation from the rest, created with purposes known only to the Emperor himself and a select few of his confidants. No doubt Malcador the Sigillite and the great Constantine Valdor. The truth behind the Triad's formation seems to have perished with those who once knew of it. For both the Salamanders and the Space Wolves, there was a stark divergence in their gene-forged capabilities compared to their compatriots, which led to certain uncertainty surrounding the Trefoil Legions, setting them further apart from the other Proto-Legions. In particular, it was rather concerning to many that their initial intake of recruits, around whom a cloud of dark rumors swirled, had rather notable issues. In the case of the 6th Legion, the divergence in the origin and the genetic makeup of its recruit was starkly evident. Surviving records indicate that the individuals were some of the most savage and hyper-violent outcasts of pre-unification Terra, selected in particular with this bias in mind for the Legion. However, unlike other proto-legions, there appeared to be no signs of a unifying strain of warrior culture within the Space Wolves. The selection of the inductees seems to have been done on an individual-by-individual basis, seeming to emphasize diversity rather than homogeny, while other proto-legions such as the 10th, later known as the Iron Hands, and the 15th, later known as the Thousand Sons, bore strong cultural imprints from the warlord empires of Terra. The 6th Legion was in essence a blank slate. Their cohesion was forged not from a shared heritage or history, but through rigorous training and isolation, overseen by the strategos of the Emperor's inner circle. What further distinguished the 6th Legion was the unique nature of their gene seed, though its distinct qualities were not yet as apparent to outside observers. The 6th Legion's progress through the various stages of the initial expansion of the Imperium was noted to be significantly slower than many of its peers. In the earliest years, only the 20th Legion experienced a comparable pace of growth, their origins seemingly also intentionally obscured. Retrospective analysis suggests strongly that this was likely due to the Legion's high fatality rates during the implantation process, a factor attributed to the unstable gene seed of Leman Russ. It was only later through the incorporation of their Primarch's current genetic pattern that this instability was largely mitigated. Due to these complications, like the other Trefoil proto-legions, the 6th Legion was largely held back from full engagements, unlike the Hounds of the Emperor and the Revenant Legion, meaning that even during the later stages of the Unification Wars and the initial reconquest of the the Sol system, they were rarely deployed, if at all. This not only further isolated them from their peers, but also denied them from significant recruitment opportunities that legions involved in key battles and subjugations, such as those of Luna, enjoyed. Paradoxically, this isolation may have spared them from the catastrophic gene seed crisis that almost obliterated the Third Legion, known as the Emperor's Children, and caused severe setbacks to the Fifth, also known as the White Scars, and the issues that would long plague the Ninth Legion, later known as the Blood Angel. It was not until almost a full decade after the Great Crusade had pushed beyond the confines of the Sol system that the Sixth Legion was deployed en masse. Whatever transpired in that preceding decade remains, in essence, lost to all Imperial historians. However, there are hopes that within the libraries, records of the Space Wolves' early history still exist. In the records of the Space Wolves' own history, they note their first great engagement being the compliance of 122, known to its human inhabitants as Delfsvan, and these records are remarkably clear, as the Space Wolves were dispatched from the shadow of the Principa Imperialis. Their great expeditionary fleet would be led by the Emperor himself, a great honor to be sure, as they were deployed at full strength, which looking back on things is remarkably low. Merely 3,500 Astartes, who would all descend upon the world that had met the Imperium's overtures with ruthless violence, which would eventually lead to the devastation of the ruling class of the planet. Since Delfsland had emerged from the Age of Strife relatively intact, and they were noted to have retained a technological advancement unlike many others within the galaxy, and a heavily industrialized society governed by a militarized plutocracy committed to increasing the tangible profits of the world and the political control, marked the planet as one non-compliant, but not due to deviancy or a deep-seated malice, but rather their hubris was what set them against the Imperium and sealed their fate, as they would learn the price of their arrogance with the Emperor's unleashing of the Sixth Legion upon them with all the might and the fury of the Wolf King's wrath. In the aftermath of this deployment, the Sixth Legion, now under the command of its first Legion Master, Commander Enoch Rathvin, would face a decisive test, as they would now be left largely to their own devices for the planning and execution of the operation itself, as the Emperor had merely deployed them on the planet, which would function as a crucible meant to forge them into a proper legion. Enoch would then orchestrate a complex multi-vector plane strike assault that focused its fury on the Mansur Core, which was the fortified heart of the most influential combine on the planet. The assault would commence under the cover of an intense, near indiscriminate bombardment of the target cities and the outlying areas, pushing in any refugees inwards in order to overwhelm what infrastructure remained. And in the ensuing chaos, the Sixth Legion would execute multiple simultaneous breaches via gunship and drop pod insertion in order to achieve a near total deployment of their forces within a single solar hour, a feat which would leave no room for a strategic reserve. The initial tactical observations made by the Imperial officers noted a seeming resemblance of their tactics to a point of the spear type method, which seemed to mirror that practiced amongst many of the other legions. However, particularly under the auspices of the 16th Legion, led by Horus Lupercal, at the time the only discovered Primarch, depending on the records, because some show that there was another, found mere days after the Primarch scattering, but that is a story for another time. However, what actually unfolded in the Space Wolves assault was something different. A sudden and overwhelming assault, which was designed to cut off attempted counterattacks by the defenders, leading to a quick disintegration of their forces into panicked routes, leaving the beleaguered militia ensnared by the thousands of fleeing civilians previously shifted by the Space Wolves. Faced with not only the assaulting wolves, but a mass exodus of terrified humanity, the Space Wolves' adversaries were met by an even greater ferocity, as the Sixth Legion now smelled the scent of blood in their enemy, which incited them to intensify their assault greatly, as the entirety of the Legion descended upon the Messner Core with a relentless savagery which the human defenders of the world had been unready for, and the ensuing carnage was utterly unparalleled. Debate remains amongst historians to this day whether during this moment of violence the Legion's command lost control of its warriors, if only for a brief time. or if Enoch, the commander of the 6th, did not immediately curb his force's bloodlust intentionally. By the time the city's surrender, the streets of the planet had been painted crimson with the blood not only of its warriors, but of its peaceful inhabitants, a grim testament to the ends of ferocity the 6th Legion was willing to go to in order to accomplish their mission. The annihilation of the Masonic Corps would serve its intended purpose, as the leaders of the planet's remaining combines witnessed their future fate through the death of their most powerful peer. They would soon realize the futility of any further resistance, as the planet was now chastened and kowtowed into capitulating to the Imperium's rule. While the cost of human lives within the Masonic Corps was staggering and quite frankly appalling, it was relatively small in comparison to compliance operations done by such legions as the Revenants and the Hounds of the Emperor, also known as the Warhounds, who were often known as raising entire world into submission. By comparison, the conduct of the 6th Legion during this operation merely stirred slight unease within the Imperium's hierarchy. Unease not due to the results achieved, as the planet was fully compliant in a remarkably short amount of time, but rather due to the apparent lack of discipline of yet another legion, as more and more of the Emperor's warriors seemed to be monsters in human skin rather than proper exemplars of humanity. Despite this discomfort, the Emperor found the 6th Legion's performance to be acceptable and even commendable, deeming them worthy of a greater responsibility. In recognition of their effectiveness, Expeditionary Fleet 115 was assigned to the 6th Legion, although it would still be nominally affiliated with the core of the mighty Principia Imperialis. This mighty fleet would be allowed to operate with a significant degree of autonomy, as long as it completed its tasks diligently, as it would be complete with its own tenders and escort craft, along with a myriad of other warships not officially recognized as part of the fleet. At that time, this anomaly would mark the beginning of the Space Wolves' privileged position within the Emperor's finest. For a subsequent 12 standard years, the 6th Legion, now a prominent fleet in the command of a significant portion of the Great Crusade, continued to carve its path across the galaxy, its numbers growing steadily, reaching approximately 5,000 Astartes at the Battle of Hintex, and swelling to 7,000 by the outset of the Relvos landing campaign. Despite this growth, the 6th Legion remained relatively modest in size by comparison to its peers. In contrast, the Luna Wolves and the Dark Angels boasted numbers 3 to 4 times greater, respectively. Consequently, the 6th Legion often operated in conjunction with other legions and large Imperialis auxiliary forces during major campaigns. Alternatively, they would be entrusted with smaller yet highly demanding shock assault missions. Throughout this period of time, the Legion distinguished itself amongst its peers through its specialized capabilities in rapid and decisive operations. It excelled in conducting swift hunter-killer missions. Particularly, they were lauded to be incredible in urban combat situations, and in particular, they were rather proficient at executing punitive actions such as quelling rebellions and short-term reprisals before another much larger legion was able to handle the main front of conquest. These tasks, at least for the time, would seem well suited to the legion's strengths and sensibilities, as Commander Enoch frequently sought such assignments for his forces. Interestingly, it was during these times when many other legions began adopting distinctive liveries and developing martial traditions. However, unlike them, the 6th Legion maintained a remarkably austere appearance, as their armor and insignia remained largely unadorned, with modifications being limited to denoting combat roles and tactical divisions. And while rather different than the current Wolves of Fenris, this was a deliberate choice to maintain minimalism in order to set themselves apart from their increasingly elaborate and symbolically armored contemporaries, as the 6th Legion preferred to focus on martial efficiency over ceremonial grandeur. Amongst the 6th Legion's operational structure, one notable element came to its head: its disciplinary corps, particularly its consul oppressorari, who wielded the power over life and death when involving their fellow Astartes. This authority would be symbolized by the twin flame blade insignia of the Sangusta, and it was an icon which was at least in partial usage at the time by the disciplinary master and the Prosvite's corps of the Imperial militia, as it seems that even back then the Space Wolves had begun to form a bond with their human compatriots. In these early years of the Great Crusade, many would note the blend of feral aggression and unchecked ferocity that the Sixth was becoming rather synonymous with, as they would become known as having a rather strong inclination to extreme measures, which would often lead to greater and greater reliances on their own disciplinary corps, which were significantly more necessary than that of other legions, with only the 12th Legion potentially surpassing them in that regard. The role of the disciplinary corps within their legion seemed almost necessary in order to retain any order within their ranks, both within and outside of combat. These units were tasked with enforcing obedience and preventing the circumvention of orders passed down by the hierarchy, in essence a role similar to that of a commissar, with a similar outcome if enough disobedience was spotted. The Council Oppressori would be made up of the most mentally stable, and those veterans who were members of the 6th Legion and followed orders would end up being marked by a distinctive emblem, setting them apart from every other battle brother within the Legion, as they would stand as vivid examples, in particular after the Molaran Revolt, which occurred following a recent Imperial compliance in the world of Molaran, as its forces rebelled against the Imperium's rules, prompting a response from the 6th Legion's 8th Company. What began as a precision strike with relative low necessity for the Oppressori quickly escalated into widespread and uncouth violence. The Space Marines that were sent in the relentless assault endangered the very survival of the planet's infrastructure and the segments of the population which had not rebelled, forcing the disciplinary corps's hand and having to intervene through rather violent methods in order to restore order, saving the remaining populace in the city, albeit at the cost of numerous executions of Astartes. To many, this marked the necessity to find this legion's sire as soon as possible. By the second decade of the Great Crusade, the 6th Legion's reputation within the wider Imperial forces would continue to erode, becoming decisively mixed. Although the records of their victories were rather impressive, with numerous battle honors to their name, they would be frequently criticized for their indiscriminate collateral damage and high civilian casualties of their campaigns, as rumors circled about of the Legion's brutality and their perceived affinity for excessive violence, particularly against those weaker than them, the human populations of the worlds they were supposed to bring under compliance. Once again, putting them in the minds of many within the company of both the Warhounds and the Revenant Legion. In these early stages, before any impact from the Fenrisian culture and the eventual emergence of the Canis Helix gene seed mutation, there were already signs of a rather bestial nature amongst the 6th Legion and their warriors. These early indications, however, would not be as pronounced as they would later become, which could be due to the large amount of executions necessitated by the Legion's own recurring plague of internal strife, as reports suggested that the strength of its officers was often overshadowed by the need to establish authority constantly. Factionalism and internal violence within the ranks was reportedly all too common, a stark contrast to the more disciplined legions. And while most Primarchs had yet to assert their influence within the legions, the 8th Legion, for instance, was beginning to garner a rather notable reputation as the Emperor's agents of fear and terror. In this context, the 6th Legion's perceived unnecessary savagery was often likened to that of the Night Lords, raising rather crucial concerns amongst the Great Crusade's human hierarchy, as these were seen as warnings that the Legion's unrestrained aggression could lead to uncontrollable behavior being aimed at their own allies, especially since they were not controlled by a Primarch. However, the most staggering criticism directed at the 6th Legion was a notable desire and eagerness that they had to pursue and assault already defeated and surrendering enemies, particularly when they had already given a farewell to arms or were in the process of fleeing to medical encampments. This would lead to the Space Wolves gaining their first moniker, and it was one of rather derisive intent. They would become known as the Rout, evoking the images of jackals and other such beasts from Terra's arid wastelands, as many would suggest that the 6th Legion preferred to prey on already weakened foes, or those who had been exhausted by others. However, there were other comparisons, those to the Warhounds. However, unlike the Warhounds, who were celebrated for their ferocity in battle and noted for their disciplined and honorable conduct, the Space Wolves were not. Ironically, the comparison between the Space Wolves and the Warhounds would seem to flip as the legions followed divergent paths after the discovery of their respective Primarchs, whose influences on their future were greater than the influences that the legions themselves had already had. Eventually, the Emperor would rediscover the Wolf King. And so we find ourselves back at the rediscovery of the Primarch Leman Russ. And unlike the return of Horus, the supposed first Primarch, there are only certain things that would become known, as Leman Russ was the second Primarch to appear at the Emperor's side exclusively, emerging from the death world of Fenris a few standard years before the Emperor's discovery of Ferris Manus on Medusa. Fenris itself, the Emperor noted, was a planet steeped in ancient mystery and legend, which was fortunate since it also meant that they had kept some of the best records of the ancient star charts, which dated back to the Dark Age of technology. And with the discovery of the Primarch, the Fenrisian sagas would recount that the Emperor, in the guise of a plain robe, cloaked in psychic runes designed to confuse and confound, arrived at the Hall of the Great Russ, which, despite the Emperor's great and godly presence, was initially unrecognized by the natives and Russ's own Fenrisian wolves, who, however, would recoil from the strange visitor for some reason unknown to them, explaining that his own submission would not come without a forthcoming trial of strength. And as this mysterious visitor approached the gnarled wooden throne of the Wolf King, and observing Russ's procession over the grand feast that occurred that night, Russ would issue a challenge. The terms set by Russ went as follows. Should the visitor win, he would be granted the honor of drinking at Russ's right hand during the feast. Should he fail, he would serve Russ for a year. The stranger, undeterred, accepted the challenge. Russ's first contest was that of consumption. He proposed an eating competition, a fitting challenge given the occasion. The Emperor, despite consuming an impressive amount of food, was outmatched by Russ, who had already devoured 3 entire Arkosh by the time the Emperor had looked up, leading to the first loss of a challenge. Undeterred, Russ would escalate the contest to a drinking competition. The Emperor, tackling the strong Fenrisian mead with fervor, quickly consumed 6 barrels, only to find that Russ had already emptied the entirety of the supply. Again, the Emperor faced defeat. Anger would then be sparked in Russ's eyes, as he was accused of being a drunkard and a glutton, with no more to offer than indulging in exercises of boasting and excess. For the final challenge, Russ boldly claimed that he could defeat the Emperor in combat, leading to the court falling to silence as Russ, angered by the statements, drew his sword and mounted the banquet table. The Emperor, discarding his cloak, revealed himself in his true form, a towering figure in Baroque golden power armor, who would then engage in combat. The Emperor, now wielding his great power claw, struck a decisive blow that felled Russ. When Leman Russ regained consciousness within the hour, he acknowledged defeat with a bloodied smile and a broken fang, and with a solemn oath he would pledge his fealty to the Emperor of mankind, recognizing him as his true father and his one and only sovereign. From here, Russ would join the Great Crusade. Upon removing Leman Russ from the death world of Fenris, the Emperor embarked on the formidable task of educating him in the sophisticated ways and technology of his vast Imperium. The training and the integration of Russ proceeded at an accelerated pace, as it only took a matter of a few solar weeks. The Emperor deemed Russ ready to lead his legion in the Great Crusade that quickly. Thus, Leman Russ was introduced to the warriors of the 6th Legion, who had been created through the implantation of gene seed organs derived from his very own DNA. In this monumentous development, Leman Russ would quickly be established as the progenitor and father, along with being the lord of the newly renamed Space Wolves Legion. And that was not all. Russ would also be equipped with what is referred to as a thrice blessed suit of power armor, and was armed with the legendary frost blade Milgenar, forged from the teeth of the great kraken Gormingal. This blade was reputed to possess the power to cleave through the ice mountains of Fenris on its own, without adding the legendary power of a Primarch to it. Accompanying Leman Russ were several hundred of his Fenrisian warriors, who despite their advanced age would be able to successfully undergo the rigorous implantation and gene processing required to become an Astartes. While many had perished during this arduous transformation, the survival rate was notably higher than anticipated. This statistical improvement can be attributed to two factors. First, the stabilizing influence of Russ's own gene helix pattern, now that it was fully developed into adulthood, which effectively mitigated the previous difficulties associated with the candidate's survival. Secondly, the inherent resilience of the Fenrisians themselves was notably higher than those Terran-born, a trait which was likely forged by their harsh environment and the planet's myriad mysteries, which all would contribute to them being able to become space wolves at a significantly later time than average. These Fenrisians became Russ's first Varagir, sometimes referred to as the Varengi in Imperial records, or more literally, his wolf guard. They were fiercely loyal to Russ, even to the point of facing death to stand by his side. Their unwavering dedication saw them leave their icy world in order to venture with him across the stars, following their lord with a determination heretofore unseen. Despite the formidable strength and the fearsome reputation of transhuman Astartes of the 6th Legion, these Wolf Guard earned Russ's respect due to their profound loyalty, setting them apart from even some of the more experienced Space Marines in the Legion. This distinction marked the beginnings of a new era for the 6th Legion, signifying that under the leadership of the Wolf King, their path would deviate and diverge sharply from that of any other legion. As the strands of iron are twisted and hammered together in the forging of a killing blade, so shall we be. I and my oath-sworn have been until now the wolves of Fenris, and you, cousins of my blood, the wolves of Terra. Together we shall become the wolves that stalk the stars, and the beasts that crawl and feed in the darkness of the void shall come to fear us, and know themselves hunted. This was an excerpt from Leman Russ, once assuming command of his legion, as historical records concerning the transition in command of the 6th Legion suggest that the process was relatively smooth after said speech, at least within the initial stages. The fact that their new Primarch was one of the earliest to be rediscovered by the Emperor was a source of both celebration and pride within the Legion. Despite Leman Russ's barbaric demeanor, this was a matter of less concern to many of the Astartes given their own origins and experiences, as it would be for other legions, and in large part this was due to Leman Russ's renowned charisma, which swiftly inspired a deep sense of awe amongst those newly under his command. In a legion which revered strength above all else, Russ's prowess was so pronounced that it seemed almost otherworldly in comparison to his peers. The previous commander, Enoch, relinquished his position with a degree of reluctance but without open defiance. The introduction of Russ's own Wolf Guard, Fenrisian warriors who would be dispersed throughout the ranks, did in fact cause some resentment. However, Russ's authority was firmly established, and his Wolf Guard were ready to resolve any dispute through single combat if necessary. To forestall any potential discord, Leman Russ wisely chose to lead his legion into battle right after getting them to acquiesce to his rule. By fighting alongside his kin and Genesons, Russ sought to forge a unified force through shared bloodshed and mutual peril, thereby cementing the bond between himself and his new warriors. This strategy not only quelled any potential unrest, but symbolically transformed the 6th into a cohesive entity under the banner of their new Primarch. The inaugural campaign which would be undertaken by Russ in order to accomplish this, and his newly minted Space Wolves Legion, was meticulously chosen in close consultation with both Horus and the Emperor. Their target was a region known as the Wheel of Fire, situated at the galactic east of the Segmentum Solar. This area was characterized by its tumultuous environment, in large part due to an erratic star, a blazing nebula, and frequent ion and inferior tempests. This sector was also known to be the home of nigh innumerable Xenos-occupied worlds, many under the control of the Orcs, which frequently sent drifting space hulks and marauder attacks into the Imperium's burgeoning territories. Given the sparse human occupation, limited resources, and the high cost of pacification, the Wheel of Fire had been previously left largely untouched, acting as a containment area, with only a few probing raids conducted. However, the Great Crusade aimed to advance towards the more significant and perilous worlds beyond Serifia, which were controlled by a vast Orc empire. To prevent the Orcs from threatening the Crusade's rear, the 6th Legion was tasked with seizing and purging the Wheel of Fire no matter the cost. Amongst the notable engagements of this campaign was a massive joint compliance operation involving multiple Legiones Astartes, including the Iron Warriors and the White Scars, as well as thousands of Imperial Auxilia, and a not insubstantial amount of Mechanicum assets. Their mission was to eradicate the enormous Orc horde led by Mashhog. According to legends, the Primarchs Leman Russ and Jagatai Khan were instrumental in routing the Orcs of Overlord Mashhog, while Perabo would be credited with devising the optimal strategies to bypass the Orcs' low orbital defenses. This campaign raged for a grueling 5 standard years, marked by the relentless tempo and unyielding fury of each and every last battle. The 6th Legion would suffer devastating losses, with nearly a third of its forces, both warriors and ships, perishing at the end of this campaign within the Wheel of Fire. Amongst the casualties was the increasingly unstable commander Enoch, who had met his end crushed in the hydraulic claws of an Orc hellcrawler during a charge on Zayat. Despite the heavy toll, for every Astartes who fell, hundreds or perhaps thousands of Orcs would be slain. This conflict was characterized by the uncompromising resolve on both ends, reflecting both the Legion and the Orcs' inherent natures. This was not a campaign of mere conquest for the 6th, but one of extermination, which would be executed with every level of ruthlessness and endurance beyond the capabilities of unaugmented humans. Under Leman Russ, the Legion's old excesses and atrocities would be transformed. The Legion's bloodlust would be tempered with discipline and an iron will. Its rage controlled by duty and loyalty, instilled with a sense of pride in its own power, and the formidable violence that lay within their hearts would be leashed. Russ would refrain from allowing his legion to seek glory for its own sake or to indulge in mindless slaughter. Instead, he imbued the legion with a sense of purpose and honor, however bleak that honor would appear to an outsider. Their service to the Emperor was sacred, as they would be the fangs of humanity's defense. Just as on Fenris, where survival was a paramount concern, the legion was tasked with ensuring that the galaxy would become safe for human life to prosper, meaning that it would accomplish this task even if it meant cleansing it with blood. Armed with his formidable frostblade, Leman Russ would relentlessly and ferociously lead his legion from the front throughout the crucible of the Great Crusade. He was at the forefront of every battle, embodying the archetype of a warlord, his presence heralded by the chilling howls of his lupine allies, which would be drawn from the Fenrisian wolves and modified to become fiercer companions. These space wolves would be led by their indomitable Primarch in a manner that they would act as the vanguard of the Imperium's military efforts, cutting down all adversaries in their path. During the early stages of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium's conquests were still far from assured, the need for a formidable leader like Russ was paramount. Despite the re-emergence of several other Primarchs, from Ferris Manus, Fulgrim, and even Dorn, Leman Russ remained an essential figure in the Imperium's expansive war machine, especially following the costly Wheel of Fire campaign, as the Legion would be reconstituted and prepared for further conflict. Over the subsequent solar decades, Russ and his Legion achieved numerous victories across the galaxy, as their campaigns spanned a variety of operations, from solitary engagements to commanding extensive fleets and auxilia regiments, including multiple detachments of Space Marines whose Primarchs had yet to be discovered. This often overlooked period within the Legion's history underscores how effective they were and how they were not exclusively the savage stereotype that they are currently seen as. The 6th Legion's successes were rather notable, as they defeated the Xenos and routed them from their domain, including multiple Orc empires, along with being able to take Eldari-held territories, including bringing down the ancient hiveworld of Nova Borgia, where they would dismantle the millennia-old tyranny of the Normans Logan. This campaign was particularly significant in earning Russ an honor from the Mechanicum, as he had located an ancient battle tank, STC, which was restored and became quintessential in the Imperium, to the point that it was named after him, in great honor. As time went on, the warriors of Russ began to identify themselves as the Valka Fenrica, or the Wolves of Fenris, in their now native dialect. The 6th Legion's distinctive emblem of a snarling crimson wolf head would become synonymous with their identity, earning themselves the moniker of Space Wolves more broadly. This name, while evocative, caused no shortage of irritation from Horus Lupercal, whose own Luna Wolves shared a similar design and naming scheme. Yet, despite their considerable achievements, the Space Wolves would still hold their hard-earned reputation for brutality and excessive methods. The extreme measures, particularly those used against who they deemed as traitors or oathbreakers, fueled further tales about their legion. These accounts were further exacerbated by the increasingly fierce demeanor and appearance of the Space Wolves, whose name now reflected both their heraldic symbol and their fearsome reputation. Eventually, the Space Wolves would become pivotal in multiple and extensive Imperial compliance campaigns, in particular with the rediscovery of the night world of Moloch. The campaign to bring the planet into compliance was orchestrated by the Emperor himself, as he saw the combined might of several Legiones Astartes, including the Luna Wolves, the Dark Angels, and once again the White Scars, alongside thousands upon thousands of troops from the Imperial Auxilia, along with a large amount of Mechanicum assets and forces from the Legio Titanicus. Following their decisive victory, Cyphrin Divine of House Divine was appointed to be the planetary government of Moloch. In a dramatic turn of events, the Emperor, accompanied by his Primarch sons, or at least most of them, would lead them to the concealed warp portal beneath the surface of Moloch. Here he would enter the realm of chaos and supposedly engage with the ruinous powers. Upon his return, the Emperor appeared significantly aged, but was markedly more powerful, by several degrees even, and eventually he would subsequently erase the memories of his sons of said world and establish a formidable garrison on the planet to safeguard the secrets of this warp portal. This garrison would be comprised of nearly 100 regiments of Imperialis Auxilia, who would be permanently stationed there, 3 fully armed and supported cohorts of the Legio Titanicus, and 2 fully armed and completely loyal to this singular task detachments of Space Marine legionaries. As the Space Marine legions would then expand the Imperium's reach, each Primarch sought to distinguish themselves in the eyes of the Emperor. Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, was driven by a fierce determination to surpass even Horus Lupercal of the Luna Wolves alongside Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels in victories. This ambition came to head on the world of Dulan, where the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels would engage in a campaign to bring the planet into Imperial compliance. During this conflict, a slight against Leman Russ's honor by the planet's leader would spark a personal vendetta. When the Dark Angels, led by Lionel Johnson, and the Space Wolves by Russ, would storm the leader's stronghold, Russ arrived into the throne room to find that Lionel Johnson had already executed the man who had slighted him. Enraged that the honor of the kill had been denied to him, Russ confronted L. Johnson in a verbal scuffle, which would culminate in a physical altercation between the two Primarchs. The skirmish, which reportedly lasted over a day of non-stop combat, ended with Russ recognizing the futility of their feud and bursting into laughter. Misinterpreting Russ's laughter as mockery, Lionel Johnson reportedly responded with a forceful punch that knocked Leman Russ unconscious. This confrontation would deepen the rift between their respective legions, and by extension their successor chapters. However, rather than animosity, what would be built would be a long-standing rivalry that persists to this day. And although recent developments have mitigated any animosity, it still remains customary for selected champions from both chapters to engage in non-lethal duels whenever they meet, serving as a ritualistic nod to their ancient rivalry. As the Great Crusade would continue to progress, discontent would grow within the Imperial military, as there were increasing murmurs about Angron's sanity and the madness that had quickly overtaken the World Eater's Legion. These concerns would transform into open demands of censure, especially since reports would emerge of Angron's rather horrific actions. It was said that Angron had ordered his apothecarian to perform a widespread psychosurgery upon his legion, including the implantation application of the notorious butcher's nails, a cranial implant which was responsible for his own mental instability, into his legion. This was following the brutal Gehenna massacre. This massacre, instigated by Angron, had resulted in the complete annihilation of a rebellious planetary populace in a single night of unprecedented bloodshed. In response to this atrocity, the Emperor would take swift action, summoning Angron to Terra for a formal reprimand. The Emperor would then dispatch Leman Russ and his Space Wolves to Gehenna with the instructions to apprehend and bring Angron back to Terra, even if it required overwhelming force. Russ, aware of the severity of the Emperor's orders against such prohibited surgeries, attempted to reason with his troubled brother. However, Angron, driven to a mad frenzy by the butcher's nails, which he sought to implant within his legion, found himself unresponsive to any form of diplomacy. The situation would escalate tensions between the two legions to a boiling point. The precise catalyst for the ensuing conflict remains unclear to this day, but Russ prudently commanded his legion to withdraw, recognizing that continued hostilities would lead to their mutual destruction. Subsequently, the World Eaters were ordered to retreat from the northern fringes of known space, as they would be tasked with engaging Xenos threats from the Imperium's core. This tragic clash, marked by its intensity and profound repercussions throughout history between the two Primarchs, would become known as the Night of the Wolf. The next event of major note within Imperial records is the Arghou campaign. Conducted in the twilight years of the Great Crusade, this was a conflict of a significant degree. An Imperial compliance order executed by the loyal Thousand Sons and a contingent of Space Wolves. The primary objective was the compliance of Arghou, officially designated 2816 in Imperial records, a world whose integration into the Imperium was accomplished largely through diplomatic means by the Thousand Sons. The inhabitants of the world harbored ancient legends about a race of beings known as the Elohim, which may correspond to the Eldar of Imperial knowledge. According to their local mythology, the Elohim were beset by a corrupt demonic force called the Heshtari, who had been part responsible for the Elohim's succumbing to the hedonistic and self-obsessive excesses which led to their demise. These demons were purportedly imprisoned within a colossal artificially constructed mountain, creatively referred to by the Thousand Sons as the Mountain. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was deeply intrigued by both the mountain and the dormant demons which it contained. His investigation would reveal that the mountain functioned as a gateway to a vast web-like network of conceptual conduits linking multiple worlds, much like a miniature version of the webway. Unfortunately, the connection to this network was corrupted by the warp, rendering it unstable. During Magnus's exploration, the corruption inadvertently released what we now refer to as demonic entities, which seized control of massive revenant titans guarding the mountain and launched a full-on assault against Magnus and his forces. The demonic onslaught was repelled through the concerted efforts of Magnus and the Thousand Sons in collaboration with almost the entirety of the Space Wolves' 5th Great Company, led by Jarl Ahamondai Sasken Sarkassason. This Space Wolves contingent had recently arrived from the Arc Reach cluster. Initially, Magnus had been irked by the Jarl's abrupt and demanding approach, a hallmark of the 6th Legion's very style of action, which ended up delaying their response, costing them heavily. However, the following successful resolution of the conflict led to Magnus expressing his appreciation for the Space Wolves' support, granting his approval to the Jarl. Subsequently, Magnus would lead his legion to a swift return to the Arc Reach cluster, marking the conclusion of the engagement of the Arghou campaign. The Arc Reach cluster was a constellation of binary stars discovered by the Word-Bearers' 47th Expeditionary Fleet, and it was home to several hostile planetary empires that resisted the Imperium's overtures for integration. Diplomatic negotiations with the Phoenix Court, the governing body representing 6 systems within the cluster, would deteriorate over time, leading to the outbreak of open hostilities. The initial phase of this campaign led to the swift capitulation of the first 4 systems, as the Space Wolves and the Word-Bearers launched a relentless assault. The Space Wolves, at the time still known as a rout, engaged in a near genocidal campaign that decimated the Defiant Worlds. Concurrently, the Word-Bearers' Ashen Circle systematically dismantled local cultures, purging what they deemed as false doctrines with a destructive zeal which they would become known for. For the following 2 years, the 2 legions pressed their campaigns until only 2 worlds remained: Arc Archreach Secundus and Shrike. The Avenians, indigenous to the Archreach Secundus world, resided within several silver towers atop the planet's highest peaks, notably the peak known as Heliosa, and from here they would prove particularly obstinate. Recognizing the need for a more sustainable imperial presence, Leman Russ sought reinforcements from the nearby Argu system, which was responded to by the arrival of several thousand suns, along with Magnus the Red. This would mark a shift in the campaign's dynamics, as the deployment pace became significantly more frantic than their usual operations. The Space Wolves and the Thousand Suns would then launch a concerted effort to subdue Shrike, the final holdout world. The planet's harsh environments presented rather unique challenges, as the Imperial forces faced relentless assaults from not just those resisting on the planet, but by its hostile avian creatures, locally known as snow shrikes. These razor-beaked birds wreaked havoc on the ground forces, necessitating modifications to Imperial weaponries for effective point defense. The ferocities of the attacks would earn them the moniker of Shrike across the Imperial armies. Despite these adversities, the Thousand Suns would play a crucial role in the final stages of the campaign. Their Corvidae cult members, gifted with minor precognitive abilities, pinpointed the locations of hidden enemy forces, which aided them in creating the decisive battle at Raven's Era 93, which concluded with remarkable efficiency, incurring minimal casualties for the Imperium. The surviving Aurelian leaders and military forces would then retreat to the stronghold on Heliosa. In the aftermath, the Space Wolves, guided by Magnus the Red's insights, eradicated the remaining forces with ruthless efficiency, while the Wordbearers subjugated their fortifications in purifying flame. The Archreach cluster would finally be brought into the fold of the Imperium, though the tensions between Magnus the Red and Leman Russ would linger due to the loss of several Space Wolves due to some actions by the Thousand Suns Primarch. Even as the victorious Imperial forces celebrated their triumph over the Arvians, the tensions between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Suns surged to a breaking point. During the climactic battle of Phoenix Crag, which was the capital city on Shrike, the Crimson King, Magnus the Red, was deeply disturbed by what he was perceiving as wanton destruction and the near extinction of the planet's populace by the Space Wolves. From his perspective, the Space Wolves had engaged in what he viewed as a campaign of genocide and violence against a society that they deemed as decadent and irredeemable. The Space Wolves, in turn, contended that the Arabians were a relicant and degenerate people, resistant to an almost biological point to the Imperial truth. This ideology quickly divided and escalated into violent confrontation. During the skirmish, several Space Wolves charged at their Thousand Suns counterparts, prompting the Thousand Suns to respond with their formidable psychic powers. And in the ensuing battle, the death of several Space Wolves and the incapacitation of many Space Wolves by psychic assaults would take place. The conflict would take an even more dire turn when Hastur, a member of the Thousand Suns Pioneer cult, would fall victim to the dreaded flesh change, after exhausting his psychic abilities to an extreme degree. As his body began to mutate uncontrollably, creating chaos and panic within the Thousand Suns ranks, the situation grew increasingly unstable as Magnus the Red approached the afflicted Hastur, who seemed to reach out in a grotesque yet imploring gesture, embodying both forgiveness and mercy, as he opened his arms and embraced the fallen Space Marine. Before the Primarch could act, a thunderous explosion shattered the tense atmosphere, as Hastur's body was violently exploded as a single round detonated within his chest. Silence would fall over the battlefield, punctuated only by the heavy clicks of the brass casing which was fired as it struck the ground, as it was none other than Leman Russ, the Wolf King himself, who had ended Hastur's suffering and all but directly insulted Magnus the Red. The Wolf King, with a demeanor of cold determination, approached Magnus. As both sides prepared for an inevitable clash, the specter of total war loomed large. However, an imminent disaster was narrowly averted when Primarch Lorgar interceded. With his skillful rhetoric and calming presence, Lorgar managed to diffuse the rather volatile volatile situation. Magnus would vehemently oppose the continued ravaging of Heliosa, while Russ asserted his claim over the world and desired to continue his activities, insisting that it was his prerogative to act as he deemed fit. And since the world had chosen to defy him, thereby the Imperium, they had sealed their fate. As the Wolf King prepared to depart from this, he turned to Magnus and issued a blood oath. With a dramatic gesture, Russ sliced the palm of his hand and let the blood fall to the ground, vowing that a reckoning was inevitable. He then raised his hand and unleashed a primal howl, a mournful cry that resounded within his warriors. This lament served as both a tribute to the fallen and a grim harbinger of the unresolved tensions that would remain, and inevitably shape the future of confrontations between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons. By the 2nd century of the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves had solidified themselves in their unique positions within the Imperium. Their expeditionary fleets and task forces operated with a level of autonomy that set them apart from their fellow legions, as they moved and fought on their own terms, responding to requests for aid solely based on the judgment of their warlords. It was well established that the Legion answered to no one but their Primarch, Leman Russ, and Russ himself acknowledged only the Emperor as his superior. This unwavering loyalty to their Primarch and the Emperor was the cornerstone of the Space Wolves' identity, as they were openly indifferent to the opinions of other Primarchs or provincial governors, only holding a complex mix of camaraderie and rivalry with the Dark Angels, shaped by their shared history. Towards other legions, these sentiments ranged from respect to a barely concealed disdain, particularly towards the Thousand Sons, who they viewed with open scorn. The Space Wolves' domain was singular, Fenris. At this point, the Legion's self-sufficiency rendered them almost completely independent, relying on external sources only for the construction of advanced warships along with new weaponry, which they would procure sporadically from Terra or the Forge World of Ryza and Lucius. Access to Fenris was strictly controlled, and only the emissaries from the Throne World would be permitted to approach. Even other Astartes would be restricted. This isolation contributed to the Space Wolves' reputation for inscrutability and mystery. Many who observed them from the outside were intimidated, and yet they remained unaware that this fear was a deliberate aspect of the Space Wolves' strategy. The perceived barbarity of the Space Wolves was not one born of mere savagery, but it was a calculated and refined element of their warfare. It was, in essence, a facade, expertly crafted to project an image that suited their strategic objectives. Allies and adversaries would perceive them as little more than brutes, underestimating the 6th Legion, failing to recognize the precise and lethal nature of the weapon that was the Space Wolves. The post-Rangdang programs were but one chapter of a series of covert conflicts waged by the Space Wolves at the behest of the Emperor. Throughout the solar decades of the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves often operated from the shadows, as much as they did in the open theaters of war. Amongst their less publicized triumphs would be recorded on Black Basalt Memento Mori on Baal, and nowhere else. This was their joint effort with the Blood Angels to eradicate the 4th Great Enslaver outbreak on Poseidon's Secundus. This battle stands as one of 3 instances during the Great Crusade where an enslaver outbreak of such a severity was actively quelled without needing to resort to an exterminatus. The true scope of the Space Wolves' endeavors would remain largely obscured and only known to the Wolf King, the Great Angel, and the Emperor. Their records after this incident would include victories over formidable arcane threats such as the godlike Psyker Kings of Valurch and the insidious Larsamara infestation of Morox. These victories, along with others, are shrouded in secrecy and are only acknowledged as battle honors on the Great Bell of Terra. The full details of this conflict have been actively and deliberately obscured, and the data that remains on them either actively sealed or expunged from public knowledge. Many of the Space Wolves' later triumphs in the Great Crusade, even those not shrouded in high levels of security, were neither celebrated nor memorialized by the Imperium Imperium's remembrancers and iterators. The Legion's indifference to such accolades led to them often scorning and ridiculing these chroniclers, as it seems they embraced their roles as barbarians a little too well. In truth, the Space Wolves operated with a level of solitude and discretion unlike their facade. Their authentic histories would be preserved almost exclusively in the realms of sagas and myths, with the facts and direct memories of many who were involved in these intentionally erased through psychometric obliteration. This process was designed to protect the sanity from the horrors they had witnessed and to shield many from the knowledge deemed too dangerous to be widely known. These secrets entrusted to the Space Wolves by their Allfather and their Wolf King were guarded unto death and beyond if necessary. After this, there is the shadow of the impending Horus Heresy, and these Space Wolves once again found themselves at odds with their brother legions, in particular that of Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, who had brazenly disregarded the Emperor's edict against the use of psychic sorceries, which was an agreement and decision made by the Emperor and the other Primarchs during the Council of Nicaea. Magnus, in an attempt to warn the Emperor through astral projection that Horus had succumbed to the lures of chaos and betrayed him, unfortunately did an incredible amount of damage through his psychic intrusion into the Emperor's clandestine webway project, destroying almost every single ward that was erected to maintain the webway project apart from the warp, resulting in the deaths of thousands of workers, adepts, servitors, and essentially dooming the Emperor's hopes for humanity's future. The Emperor, unable to believe that Horus could have betrayed him, instead accused Magnus of being corrupted by Horus, or so some records say, and due to his continued practice of sorcery, he sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus in so he may be punished for his actions. However, the Primarch of the Luna Wolves, Horus Lupercal, the War Master at the time, decided to intervene to best help his rebellion by convincing Leman Russ that their father had given a new command, not to bring Magnus and the Thousand Sons in peacefully if possible, but to exterminate them, during the fall which would lead to the fall of Prospero. During the fall of Prospero, Primarch Leman Russ led his Space Wolves Legion along with a contingent of Sisters of Silence and Constantine Valder in a direct assault against the Thousand Sons. This was due to them being deceived by the War Master Horus, who had himself been corrupted by chaos and had entered the beginning stages of becoming their avatar on the mortal plane. Russ would then be persuaded to completely disregard his father's orders and launch a full-scale planetary invasion. Rather than seek out peaceful negotiation, Leman Russ acted upon his long-held grudges against Magnus, which Horus was easily able to exploit. The assault on Prospero itself was swift and ruthless. Despite the ferocity of the attack, many Thousand Sons, including Magnus the Red, would eventually unknowingly side with those who had betrayed them, swearing their allegiance to the Chaos God Tzeentch in order to preserve what little was left, which amounted to their esoteric knowledge of the warp and to stop the flesh change, as there were so few of them left that they risked extinction. And this was all necessitated due to a battle between Leman Russ and Magnus the Red, culminating in Leman Russ breaking Magnus's back and shattering his soul upon his knee. In the wake of the rising of Prospero, Leman Russ summoned his beleaguered Space Wolves Legion to regroup within the Alexis Nebula. However, unbeknownst to the Wolf King, Horus had orchestrated a devastating assault by the Alpha Legion, which descended upon the exhausted and wounded Space Wolves with overwhelming force. The Alpha Legion, led by the twin Primarchs Alpharius and Omegon, themselves had harbored a deep-seated animosity towards the Space Wolves and their Primarch Leman Russ. This enmity stemmed from Russ's continuous criticism of the Alpha Legion's reliance on subterfuge and deception in warfare, which were a stark contrast, at least on a surface level, to his own beliefs in honorable direct combat. The Alpha Legion seized this opportunity to assert their superiority by delaying the Space Wolves, thereby preventing them from bolstering the Imperial defenses on Terra for a significantly longer period of time than they would normally be able to. Desperate Russ would go on to send out distress signals to the nearby White Scars, requesting aid from his fellow Primarch Jagatai Khan. However, the Khan, currently uncertain of the Space Wolves' true allegiance amidst the confusion of conflicting astropathic messages and the knowledge that they had indeed attacked the Thousand Sons for some reason, hesitated to commit his his forces. Unsure of whom to trust, he chose to remain neutral until he could clarify the situation, leaving Russ to face the Alpha Legion alone. Isolated and demoralized, Russ retreated to his personal quarters, leaving First Captain Gunhild in command aboard battleship Ragnarok. Gungar, along with his crew, made valiant efforts to lead the Space Wolves fleet in a desperate battle for survival. However, the fleet was besieged on all sides by the far larger Alpha Legion forces. In the midst of this dire situation, Russ found solace and guidance from Bjorn the One-Handed, a respected pack leader from the Third Great Company. Bjorn's counsel helped Russ confront the harsh reality as the Emperor's executioner, a role that had only brought further suffering to his legion. Through revitalization by introspection, Russ emerged, inspiring his remaining forces, leading Gungar and his crew to fight more tenaciously, successfully being able to slow the Alpha Legion's advance. Despite their efforts, the superior numbers and tactics of the Alpha Legion ultimately overwhelmed the battered Space Wolves fleet, as the conflict in the Alexis Nebula became a testament to the Space Wolves' relentless spirit, since even with these odds they would continue to fight. Amidst the chaos in the Alexis Nebula, the Space Wolves faced one rather pivotal confrontation within this battle, as a formidable contingent of elite Cataphracti Terminators from the Alpha Legion teleported upon the bridge of the Space Wolves flagship, Harfinkel. Here, the Wolf King Leman Russ would engage in a fierce struggle against Alfarius, who had cunningly disguised himself as one of his own Liorenan Terminators. As the Alpha Legion now pressed their advantage, it seems they were poised for ultimate victory. However, right on time, an unexpected ally arrived, a sizable contingent of the Dark Angels fleet, led by the mobile Romulus-class Starfort Chimera. This intervention came in response to the Space Wolves' distress signals. The Dark Angels confirmed the Space Wolves' loyalty to the Emperor, then joined the fray, tipping the scales of battle in the favor of the beleaguered 6th Legion, as together they compelled the Alpha Legion to retreat post-haste. In the aftermath of this battle, Russ and most of his warriors sought an audience with the Dark Angels commander, Althaios. Althaios revealed that his fleet had been dispatched by the regent of Caliban, Luther, 59 Terran years prior, tasked with conquering and establishing outposts, as this contingent of Dark Angels had been unaware of the galaxy's wider rebellion or Luther's subsequent corruption, only having received fragmented and rather unclear information about the shifting loyalties and the ongoing situation within the Imperium. During the battle, Captain Ormand of the Dark Angels covertly had infiltrated the Harkafel to ascertain if the Space Wolves had turned traitor. His covert mission would be discovered by Rune Priest Kuva, who presented him to Russ. Witnessing the Space Wolves' resolute defiance against the Alpha Legion, Ormand confirmed their loyalty and thereby allowed them to be aided. With their loyalty overall affirmed, the Dark Angels were able to actively aid the Space Wolves in routing the traitor fleet. In exchange for their support, Russ provided a comprehensive account of Horus's treachery along with the broader context of the galactic upheaval, and Althaios would be deeply troubled by their revelations, resolving for the first time in over 5 decades to return to Caliban and reconnect with their legion. Meanwhile, Russ would prepare to head to Terra for the inevitable confrontation with his treacherous brothers. Eventually, once on Terra, Leman Russ would aid and lend some of his sons to the defense of the throne world. However, he would eventually set out to confront Horus directly, and for a mere moment it appeared as if he could win. Unfortunately, this was not to be, and Horus would accelerate his plans, leading to the climactic siege of Terra, where the Space Wolves found themselves on the front lines, a fact which would significantly impact the final outcome of the battle, as the arrival of the Space Wolves along with 2 other loyalist legions altered the balance of power for the loyalists, as this looming conclave of more and more loyalist Primarchs posed a threat to Horus's position, and in a desperate bid to end the civil war swiftly, Horus would then lower the shields to his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, which allowed the Emperor to act and undertake a daring maneuver, teleporting himself along with a handful handful of other warriors onto the vessel. Shortly after the battle's conclusion, the Space Wolves, Leman Russ, and their fellow legionaries arrived to the battle fairly late at its conclusion, only to find the War Master Horus, along with the Blood Angels Primarch Sanguinius, both slain in the conflict. They would also note that the Emperor had been gravely wounded and interred within the life-sustaining mechanisms of the Golden Throne by Rogel Dorn. And beside these incidents, much of the Space Wolves' time during the Heresy was focused on skirmishing against the traitors, delaying them and fragmenting their supply lines in order to allow those on Terra the best chance possible to withstand and push back against the traitors during the siege. Following the siege of Terra, the Emperor's physical form had all but perished, yet his spirit, in essence, had ascended to become the new god of mankind, residing within the Golden Throne. Leman Russ, deeply anguished by his own failure during the final confrontation aboard Horus's flagship, faced a somber reality. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium would have to embark on a relentless campaign to extinguish the lingering chaos uprisings throughout the galaxy. And in this campaign, they would not be led by their father, as they restored order across the galaxy, as the news of Horus's defeat and the rout of his traitor legions would ignite a resurgence in imperial fervor, leaving the loyalists to be driven by the death of Horus and the collapse of the traitor forces to launch a rather grand and vengeful offensive. Thus would begin the Great Scouring, one where Leman Russ and his sons would be crucial in. The Great Scouring was a period marked by intense and brutal combat, as imperial forces systematically eradicated the remaining traitor factions. The Space Wolves themselves played a pivotal role in this campaign, leading the charge against many of the scattered traitors. The Scouring would continue for 7 standard years, culminating in the defeat and exile of the last rebel elements to the isolated warp rift known as the Eye of Terror. Listen closely, brothers, for my strength wanes. There will come a time when our chapter faces extinction, and our enemies shall converge to destroy us. Then, from whatever realm I inhabit, I shall heed your call. I will come defying the very laws of life and death. At the end, I will stand with you for the final battle, for the wolf time. This was one of the last words the Primarch, Leman Russ, would speak to his Space Wolves. The fate of Leman Russ remains one of the Imperium's greatest mysteries, because in 211 M31, nearly 2 centuries after the Emperor's entombment in the Golden Throne, Leman Russ would vanish under circumstances still shrouded in uncertainty. During the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a solemn holiday commemorating the Emperor's victory over Horus and his subsequent entombment, Russ addressed the gathered warriors. As he spoke, he abruptly froze, his eyes glazing over as if witnessing a vision. The Space Wolves watched their sire in alarm as he fell to his knees and summoned his wolf guard and his closest retainers to him, but leaving the youngest amongst them, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, behind. Russ then exited the Great Hall with his bodyguard, never to return. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, now a revered dreadnought, has recounted the tale of Russ's disappearance every millennia. Amongst the Space Wolves, there exists a belief that Russ journeyed into the Eye of Terror in search of the fabled Tree of Life, a source of pure warp energy reputed to have the power to heal even the Emperor and restore him to full vitality. Each year following Russ's disappearance, his place would be lain at the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, and his drinking horn filled in anticipation for his long-awaited return. For 7 long Terran years, the Space Wolves awaited their Primarch loyally. When he did not reappear, Bjorn was appointed the new Great Wolf, and he was given the responsibility to lead the chapter on their first great hunt to locate Russ. The great companies would embark on separate voyages across the stars, battling foes and confronting a myriad of challenges. Their exploits recounted annually at All Winter's Eve, when the rune priests gathered to chant the sagas. Despite their efforts, no sign of Russ was found, and Bjorn's search culminated with him being gravely injured and entombed within a dreadnought's adamantium sarcophagus. And so the first great hunt ended in sorrow and disappointment. Subsequent great hunts yielded partial successes, as the second great hunt recovered Russ's armor from the temple of Horus on Ruda near the Eye of Terror. The fourth exposed and thwarted the Corellian conspiracy to overthrow the Administratum, and the ninth ended in the eradication of the Gene Stealer infected worlds of the Gehenna system. Each great hunt began with visions from Russ, guiding the chapter's rune priests and sending them on new quests, yet none of them have succeeded in their ultimate goal of retrieving their Primarch. Russ's final words did provide some hope to his sons that he will return in the time of the Imperium's ultimate battle against the Chaos forces, the forces of Chaos, a period he called the Wolf Time. Many Space Wolves believe that time may soon arrive, as forces bent on humanity's destruction continue to gather for their final assault. Recent reports suggest that the 13th Great Company's return from the Eye of Terror during the 13th Black Crusade in 999 M41 might signal the anticipated return of the Wolf King. Now, it must be noted that 7 long years after the fall of Horus, Reboot Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, spearheaded the second founding of Space Marines. As the de facto regent of the Imperium, Guilliman sought to address the critical flaw exposed by the Horus Heresy. The conflict highlighted the significant vulnerabilities in the gene seed of several Space Marine legions, marking them as particularly susceptible to the corrupting influences of chaos. Accelerated gene seed cultivation during the later stages of the Great Crusade had further exacerbated these defects, which the ruinous powers had exploited to turn some of Horus's traitor legions against the Emperor. Guilliman's strategic response was embodied in the Codex Astartes, which was aimed to rectify these issues and many more. The Codex mandated a reorganization of the massive Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable units known as chapters, each consisting of approximately 1,000 battle brothers. This restructuring was designed to eliminate the concentrated power wielded by a single individual over an entire legion, thereby reducing the risk of a similar corruption of a force that was nigh unstoppable. However, Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, had resisted this transformation, as the Wolf Lord was notorious for his unyielding temperament, which led to him, at one time, reportedly striking the Emperor in response to criticism. Unsurprisingly, he was equally defiant towards Guilliman. Although the threat of actual internal conflict almost escalated into another civil war, Russ eventually made a calculated concession. He agreed to restructure the Space Wolves into 13 independent great companies, each akin to a chapter in strength. In practice, however, this change was largely superficial, as the Space Wolves great companies had always operated with a similar level of autonomy, and Russ ensured that their operational structure remained largely unchanged. And what change there was the name only. Guilliman, preoccupied with the monumental task of rebuilding the Imperium, did not choose to actively verify the Space Wolves' compliance with the Codex Astartes. Consequently, the Space Wolves chapter continued to function with well over 1,000 Astartes, making it one of, if not the largest chapter in existence, rivaled only by the Black Templars, who similarly disregarded the Codex in favor of a more autonomous structure. Amidst Guilliman's reforms, Russ also sought to establish the ill-fated Wolf Brothers chapter. His plan was to create a ring of Space Marine chapters around the Eye of Terror, all of his own lineage, in order to guard against the resurgence of the traitor legions. Unfortunately, the genetic instability of the Canis Helix, which led to the curse of the Wolfen, also caused the Wolf Brothers to suffer extreme genetic deviancy. This resulted in the chapter's eventual purge by the Inquisition, as the High Lords of Terra, recognizing the genetic instability that plagued the Space Wolves gene seed, chose not to further divide and spread the genetic base of the Legion, instead containing it within Fenris. This decision also contributed to the Space Wolves' unique status as a first founding legion with no true successor chapters for much of its history. The concept of encircling the Eye of Terror with protective forces, however, would be preserved, as the High Lords of Terra would establish 20 new Space Marine chapters known as the Astartes Precious in order to monitor the Eye of Terror and prevent the ruinous powers from spreading along with their minions, in large part due to seeing the brilliance of Leman Russ's idea. As the 41st millennium neared its end, The struggle between chaos and order would reach a climax within the Fenris system, the homeworld of the Space Wolves, warriors who were renowned for their hardiness due to being the sons of Leman Russ. As the galaxy was already ravaged by countless conflicts, it seemed to face another emerging cataclysm, one of unexpected and unprecedented severity. This impending disaster was no mere coincidence, but the result of intricate schemes orchestrated far beyond mortal comprehension. The return of the long-lost Space Wolves 13th Company heralded a series of events that would indeed push the galaxy to the brink. Their resurgence was a harbinger of great turmoil set against the backdrop of a myriad of new warp storms which had spread devastation and corruption all throughout the Imperium. These storms were more than natural disasters. Instead, they were tools of chaos, designed to undermine and fracture the Imperium from within. As the storms ravaged the galaxy, they slowly sowed discord amongst the Imperial defenders. Deceptive evidence and malevolent illusions fueled mistrust and rekindled old rivalries. The once unified forces of the Space Marines found themselves at odds with each other, manipulated by the schemes of Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways. This was the god of change and deception, and he thrived amongst these conditions, using lies and deceit to pit even the most steadfast allies against one another. In the midst of this strife, the warp storms would intensify further still, unleashing demonic war hosts into the mortal realm. The Fenris system, already a bastion of resistance, now faced an unparalleled onslaught. The very forces of humanity, divided, weakened, now stood on the brink of annihilation within this sector. The siege of the Fenris system was not merely a battle, but a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle against chaos, reflecting the deep-seated conflict that threatened to tear the Imperium apart further still. The return of the Wolfen in such great numbers and the chaotic forces converging on Fenris were but pieces in a larger, more sinister plan. As the Space Wolves now focused on dealing with the dire crisis as the 41st millennium drew to a close, their trials continued to compound. Accusations of deviancy had emerged, casting a shadow over the chapter's very actions, and doubts about their integrity and loyalty to the Imperium. These concerns would prove not to be completely unfounded, as ancient prophecies and long-held legends began to materialize in now alarming ways. As this happened, companies of Space Wolves would now embark on new campaigns across a sea of stars, in order to search for their mutated kin who had gotten loose across the galaxy, the Wolfen. Individuals who were deeply affected by the Canex Helix and bearing extreme lupine characteristics had seemingly emerged as formidable warriors at the time, their appearance a grotesque amalgamation of beast and Astartes, who, despite all this, would retain the heraldic symbols of their chapter and even spoke of the ancient tongue of Asaheim. Despite the fearsome appearance and the stigma associated with the transformation, the Wolfen would prove their valor in battle. Many found themselves engaged in fierce combat against the demonic legions of the Chaos Gods, achieving notable victories despite their appearance, and with whom they seemingly arrived. The presence of the Wolfen, while unsettling, would be harnessed for the greater good, as Wolf Lord Harold Deathwolf, while holding great reservations, recognized the strategic necessity in integrating these warriors into the Space Wolves' ranks proper. Thus, the Wolfen would be assembled and directed to Fenris whenever they were found, where their ferocity and battle prowess would be deployed against the encroaching forces of chaos. This decision would mark a crucial moment in the all-hands-on-deck style defense of the Imperium that the Space Wolves would now engage in. Amidst the countless conflicts and demonic legions, it seems that the Wolfen stand shoulder to shoulder amongst their loyal Space Wolves brothers. These mutated warriors, once feared and mistrusted, demonstrated their unwavering resolve and combat efficiency. Following their initial victories, the Wolfen would be formally recognized and reintegrated by their chapter, receiving new equipment and taking their place proper amongst their ranks. Ulrich the Slayer, the venerable wolf priest and mentor to the High King Logan Grimnar, welcomed them as omens of the long-anticipated return of their Primarch Russ. Ulrich proclaimed that the wolf time was upon them, a period which they all believed would herald the eventual return of Leman Russ. Despite their heroics and the apparent vindication of their purpose, not all within the Space Wolves or beyond viewed the Wolfen favorably. Suspicion lingered amongst many of the Wolf Lords and external observers. These concerns were exacerbated by the insidious manipulations of Tzeentch, who had sown the seeds of mistrust, as now the Dark Angels chapter, known for their intricate dealings and their historical enmity with the Space Wolves, would become particularly vigilant. The rivalry between the two chapters, being a relic of ancient conflicts, heightened the tension and obscured any objective perspective, as the Dark Angel scrutiny would continue to intensify following a distressing incident on the world of Nordus. An attack by the Space Wolves targeting a site of significance to the Dark Angels led to the massacre of a garrison of Dark Angel scouts. Initial investigations pointed towards the Wolfen as being the primary culprits, casting a dark shadow over the Space Wolves' intentions and raising troubling questions about the nature of their allegiance and in particular their usage of these warriors. As the crisis unfolded, things reached a new level of complexity, where the conflict of Tarantilos would ignite further enmity between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels. Despite this, they found themselves compelled to fight side by side against the demonic forces encroaching on the world. The mutual respect between these chapters would be forged then in the crucible of their shared struggle against chaos, instead now becoming a barely masked underlying rivalry. Nonetheless, for the moment, both chapters were actively united in their efforts to repel the forces threatening the Imperium, as their combined strength formed a formidable bulwark against the encroaching darkness. This new fomented enmity seems to be in part linked to the forces of Tzeentch, as they employed elaborate schemes in order to fracture the bonds between these two Space Marine chapters, as the demon known as the Changeling fueled their growing distrust between the Space Wolves and their fellow Astartes of the Dark Angels, as now the Great Wolf and his champions were locked in relentless combat against the demonic hordes which assailed their realm. Amidst this chaos, few could actively counter the dark allegations that were leveled against the Space Wolves, at least actively. As the battle raged on, even the Grey Knights would join in the fray, fighting alongside the Space Wolves in order to drive back the malevolent entities which sought to make their home on the material plane. These alliances would achieve significant victories, banishing countless demons from reality. Yet amidst their successes, a far graver threat festered within the Space Wolves themselves. Unbeknownst to them, their true adversaries was not only the forces of chaos, but also the insidious corruption within their own ranks. Those Space Wolves who had fought alongside the Wolfen would find their primal instincts increasingly dominating their actions, as they began a bestial transformation which drove them to more savage and violent acts of a bestial nature, with some even undergoing physical mutations that mirrored their lost brethren. Evidence of their severe genetic deviancy would become pervasive amongst all the great companies of Fenris. The initial fears that the return of the lost company heralded a curse would indeed manifest into the grim reality of the situation they were currently facing. As the situation deteriorated, the conjecture hardened into suspicion, as multiple suspicions formed into firm conclusions. The astropathic choirs would be tasked with delivering truth from the tumult, and they would sing of secrets and deception, leading to the deliberation of the Adeptus Astartes, turning somber towards the Sons of Russ, their once esteemed chapter now under heavier and heavier scrutiny, as this curse that had once whispered of the legendary return of their Genesire now was turned into a tangible affliction, casting a long shadow over their storied legacy. As the great companies of the Space Wolves would continue to return to the Fenris system, their voidcraft would increasingly reverberate with the howls of the Wolfen, as it seemed that more and more of their brothers were becoming berserk beasts. At the same time, an imposing armada of battleships, led by the fortress monastery known as the Rock, advanced towards the Fenris system. The Rock, being a colossal remnant of the Dark Angel's lost homeworlds, would now loom ominously over Fenris's orbit, casting a long shadow over the beleaguered Space Wolves in a rather literal sense The fleet's mission was clear: to arrest, interrogate, and, if deemed necessary, mete out punishment to the Space Wolves for their alleged deviance. Supreme Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels had mobilized an Imperial crusade capable of decimating even the entirety of the Sons of Russ in no longer than a fortnight, a prospect that would have delighted Magnus the Red to no end, who observed the unfolding events from his citadel in the Eye of Terror as the echoes of Prospero's ancient ruin seemed to be playing out ahead of him, satisfying him to no end, as his intricate schemes had been advancing at alarming speeds at this point. However, the Space Wolves' anticipated homecoming was far from triumphant. The planets orbiting the star known as the Wolf's Eye were already in turmoil. Voldramani, the Wolf Moon, home of the crucial astropathic relay station Longhowl, sent a distress signal which demanded urgent attention. The ocean moon Sevelgrud was besieged by an endless demonic force, with its volcanic islands struggling to maintain order amidst the chaos. On Frostheim, the main gun fortress, renowned for its formidable defenses and unyielding ice, faced a relentless assault from the Alpha Legion's traitorous warbands, who engaged in grisly blood rituals, tearing open warp rifts and spreading disaster all throughout the realms. As the Space Wolves faced calamity, they found themselves caught between the wrath of the Dark Angels and the relentless incursions of chaos. The imminent confrontation with the Imperial fleet added yet another layer to their dire situation, one which they did not desire to meet. The gravest calamity would befall Midgardia, a once proud world in the Fenris system, now reduced to a battleground of unimaginable horror. This planet was characterized by toxic jungles that drove their inhabitants into subterranean cities, which had now become overrun with the malevolent legions of Nurgle's demons. In response to this dire crisis, Logan Grimnar, chapter master of the Space Wolves, rushed to the planet's aid, accompanied not only by his elite champions of Fenris, but also by the formidable armored columns of Ingel Ironwolf, one of the greatest leaders of the Space Wolves in recent times. Their arrival was nothing short of a thunderous assault against these invaders, with many of the demons banished back into the warp by the Space Wolves' fierce counteroffensive. However, the rather inhospitable terrain of Midgardia proved treacherous, and within hours, Ingel Ironwolf and his Spears of Russ found themselves ensnared in the planet's hazardous landscape, struggling to advance, as the Space Wolves proper faced a formidable challenge, having to fight for every inch of ground they would take, regardless if there were otherworldly enemies on the planet. Meanwhile, Logan Grimnar and his champions ventured underground, where they confronted numerous plague bearers, as their battle soon led them to the architects of Midgardia's devastation, a sinister alliance known as the Infernal Tetrad, comprising of 4 demon princes. In a demonic clash, the Space Wolves engaged these colossal adversaries in fierce combat, only to be ensnared by a devastating trap from the warp, as a massive rockfall would bury the heroes, stripping the Space Wolves of their most experienced leaders at a crucial moment. Even as the Imperial fleet was poised to judge their fate, now aboard the Rock, the fate of the Space Wolves was a subject of intense deliberation. The Changeling, a shape-shifting demon of Tzeentch, had actively infiltrated the fortress monastery at this point, assuming the guise of a fallen Dark Angel scout. This deception had granted them not only access to the Rock's Apothecarion, where he subsequently massacred the fortress's Vox Senchal, but also allowed him to seat further deceit and enmity between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels. With the fleets of the Dark Angels and their allies prepared to act on orders of the Rock's commanders, the judgment of the Space Wolves would now teeter precariously. The influence of the Changeling's machinations threatened to sway the outcome of this crucial moment in the ongoing struggle between the Imperium and the forces of chaos, as the Changeling had orchestrated a masterful deception from deep within the Rock. With the Vox Senchal slain, it would now be able to disguise itself as said Senchal. The demon would then be able to wave a tangled web of falsehoods, claiming that the curse of the Wolfen was undeniable evidence of chaos corruption from the Space Wolves, while claiming that their difficulties in dealing with Midgardia's demonic infestation was not due to an actual conflict, but rather nefarious dealings between the chaos-tainted space wolves and the warp-born monstrosities. The changeling's deceit extended even further, asserting that Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf himself, had perished, and that his wolf lords were unaccounted for, in an internal conflict that would potentially turn the entire chapter to the forces of chaos and render the Imperium nearly powerless in this sector against the chaos infestation. According to the fabricator of lies, the Dark Angels alone were capable of restoring order in the Fenris system, which had succumbed to the malignant influences of chaos. Despite the heavy implications, Supreme Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels resolved to carry out the bombardment of the Fenris system following the issued orders. This course of action held a grim irony for those who understood its deeper significance, as it mirrored the tragedy of Prospero, and no doubt pleased Magnus the Red to a point of euphoria. Where the Space Wolves had once derived honor from the Emperor's harsh justice of Magnus the Red and his followers, now the Space Wolves would seemingly face a similar fate, punished for their genetic anomalies and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. For Tzeentch and Magnus the Red, this turn of events granted them a perverse delight, relishing in the symmetry of their vengeance. The Changeling's infiltration had reached its zenith, having thoroughly corrupted the bridge crew and instilled both fear and mistrust amongst the chapter's serfs and Space Marines alike. The demon would then make a critical move, posing as the Vox Sensual Mendrax. This time, it would report that the Space Wolves used the stronghold of the Long Howl to attack a fleet of Grey Knights which had recently arrived. This allegation, coupled with the incriminating footage of the Dark Angel scouts allegedly slain by the Wolfen, solidified the perception of the Space Wolves' guilt in the minds of their accusers, thus condemning the entirety of the Sons of Russ, sealing their fate under the weight of fabricated evidence and the machinations of chaos. As the Dark Angel's fleet would then prepare to unleash its unrestrained fury against the entirety of the Fenris system, which was already dealing with the ramifications of its demonic invaders. Many of the system's once vital worlds, including Midgardia, had succumbed to chaos corruption, leading to Grandmaster Azrael officially decreeing that the only solution would be the complete eradication of the planet through exterminatus. Despite the presence of the surviving Space Wolves on the surface, Azrael commanded to cleanse Midgardia with relentless fire and a profound, if subdued, acceptance. The absence of Logan Grimnar at that time led to him being presumed dead, leading to very few voices being able to contest Azrael and his decree. The Grey Knights, led by Brother Captain Avran Stern, arrived at the Rock with hopes of negotiation of a ceasefire, or at least a delaying of the onslaught. However, they found their efforts to be in vain, as the bombardment cannons of the Imperial fleet had already been activated, and the planet targeted for destruction were, at least in large part, already engulfed in the fires of chaos. Midgardia's surface would be transformed into a raging inferno, and a testament to the overwhelming force of the bombardment. On Frostheim, Mordecai's keep lay in ruins, reduced to debris by devastating lance strikes delivered by the Iron Hands chapter. The Fenris system was now officially besieged on multiple fronts, facing a relentless onslaught, not only from demonic invaders, but from forces purportedly aligned with the Imperium. As the Crusade's fleet's bombardment ravaged the system, intended allies and foes alike found themselves locked in a continuous destructive conflict. The war that Stern and Ragnar had sought to prevent was now in full force, as trusted brothers were now clashing in a tragic and unrelenting confrontation. In the midst of this turmoil, confusion reigned supreme, exacerbated by the fervor of the Crusaders and the staunch defiance of the Space Wolves. On the immense hololith displays at the forefront of the Rock's bridge, the shifting dispositions of the Imperial fleet and the beleaguered defensive citadels of the Space Wolves came into stark relief. The fate of two chapters now seemingly teetering on the edge, as their once solid alliance, now threatened by a suffocating haze of doubt and despair, seemed poised to obliterate centuries of hard-won brotherhood. The parley on the bridge of the rock was swift and charged. Once heated exchanges had subdued, it was Brother Captain Avrain Stern of the esteemed Grey Knights who emerged as the sole voice of reason within this conflict. His stature and authority lent weight to his words as he addressed the dire situation. Stern had judged the Wolfen and their allies as he had encountered them, finding them loyal and sound. However, amidst this chaos, Stern identified a hidden, insidious force, Vox Senchal Mendrix, whom he declared to be the Changeling, a demon of Tzeentch in disguise. The battle that followed in the bowels of the rock was fierce, but ultimately victorious, as the Dark Angels, now aware of the manipulation, ordered an immediate ceasefire as they redirected their efforts to purging the demonic corruption from their fortress monastery, and then dispersed the Imperium fleet throughout the Fenris system. Their new mission was to confront any world signaling Tzeentchian invasions and aid them against the demons. In the wake of these revelations, the great companies of Bran Redmaw, Gungar Red Moon, Bjorn Stormwolf, and Ingjar Krakendom, having arrived in Fenrisian face, rallied to their comrades. With the formidable demon engines known as the Silver Towers encroaching in vast numbers, the sector was now plunged into a series of desperate but brutal conflicts between the now assembled loyalists as the Imperial defenders and the Space Wolves became allies once more and fought to reclaim their besieged home. For centuries, Magnus had nursed a deep-seated hatred and desire for vengeance against the Imperium, and particularly against the Space Wolves. And in the 32nd millennium, he had launched a direct assault on Fenris, using the deceitful visions to lure great companies from their strongholds. His efforts had been thwarted by the formidable defenses of Fang and the sagacy of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, both veteran heroes of the Space Wolves. Magnus's ambitions would then evolve into more arcane and profound schemes, as his goals expanded beyond mere conquest as he aimed to dismantle everything the Space Wolves had cherished, corrupting their allies and imposing upon them the same nightmarish fate that had befallen his own legion. And it seemed the subjugation of the Fenris system at this point was merely a precursor to the climactic events that would plunge the greater Imperium into chaos. As 1,000 Suns orchestrated their machinations, they manipulated warp rifts, the very same warp rifts that had released the Wolfen, and swiftly followed them with their own Rubicine Marines. As the sorcerers of the 1,000 Suns utilized these rifts to execute what amounted to a galaxy-wide invasion using the appearance of the Space Wolves as partial coverage. The presence of the Silver Towers of Tzeentch would further intensify the conflict and allow them to amass in greater numbers. And with the Silver Towers now in the material world, Prospero had a direct opening from Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth into the Fenris system, as their arcane energies drifted through the skies of Fenris. Their bases would crack with magic lightning. Each silver tower functioned as a bastion of Magnus's chosen, emanating dark and oppressive auras of the warp and maddening the minds of all those who gaze upon them. However, despite their titanic size, they floated and shifted throughout the fabric of reality, linking Fenris to the crystal labyrinth at different points, following their master's will. As they were also armed with deadly cannons and sorcerer's weapons, these fortresses essentially became harbingers of unmitigated doom. As on Fenris, there were no fewer than 9 of these structures at any one time, potentially more due to their ever-changing nature. Each strategically positioned over sites of geomantic significance, as their appearance and this invasion marked the beginning of the Crimson King's grand design for conquest, turning Fenris once again into a battleground, not seen since the 32nd millennium. In the ongoing struggle, the Space Wolves would display their ferocity and prowess for battle, as eventually with the arrival of the Primaris Marines, they would be able to deploy these new warriors to force back the darkness. Although these new warriors had not yet been vested in the customs of Fenris, their innate hunting skills and the ability to coordinate with the existing Space Wolves marked them as formidable allies, as Ulrich the Slayer proposed that within the Primaris lies the potential cure for the Wolfen curse. However, this hypothesis was soon challenged, in large part because during the purging operation against a Drukhari raiding party on the mining worlds of Smelter's Heap, several Primaris Inceptors fighting alongside the Wolfen would succumb to their affliction. Instead of using their assault bolters from a distance, the Inceptors were driven by the curse to charge recklessly and to use their firearms as makeshift bludgeons and cudgels. Despite their initial loss of control, the Inceptors did indeed manage to repel the enemy with their sheer ferocity. Once the battle concluded, they would regain their composure to varying degrees. Yet the incident revealed the troubling truth. Even those connected to the Primarch Russ through their Primaris would be susceptible to the Wolfen curse. This would eventually lead to the founding of one of the Space Wolf's few successor chapters, which is a successor chapter seemingly only in name. And to affirm their loyalty and resolve, these successors would journey to Fenris to undertake the rigorous test of Mordecai. This grueling trial demanded that they traverse the perilous Fenrisian barrens, stripped of all clothing and weaponry, and without yielding to their innate bestial instincts. And while most of the candidates would emerge victorious, a significant number would fail to return from this harrowing ordeal. Later, in a display of dramatic firepower meant to prove their worth to their firstborn brethren, repulsors bristling with hellblasters launched an assault on the Iron Warriors' stronghold situated on the drifting planetoid known as the Midnight Moon, which was illuminated against the backdrop of the void. This dark planetoid became the fiery battleground between the two, as the Space Wolves unleashed a torrent of plasma, eventually marking them as worthy successors to Leman Russ's long-standing legacy, as they systematically dismantled the Iron Warriors' defenses. And now, across the Fenris system and throughout the war zones of the Sea of Stars, rune priests are continuously besieged by rather curious and nearly undecipherable cryptic visions, their divinatory practices repeatedly converging on one foreboding narrative: the anticipating reemergence of Magnus the Red within their system, along with the awakening of Reboot Guilliman and the echoes of eternity that would come therein. These prophetic elements all seem to culminate in the Wolf Time, and seeing as they have in large part proven themselves to happen, it seems many within the Space Wolves believe the Wolf Time is upon them. Following a heralding spirit walk, High Rune Priest Nigel Stormcaller sought an audience with Bjorn the Fell-Handed, petitioning Logan Grimnar and Ulrich the Slayer to awaken the ancient warrior. However, despite the knowledge of these events, the specifics of their discourse and their plans with yet another awakened Primarch walking amongst them remains unknown. However, it was noted that these consultations were critical in the interpretation of the ominous signs gathered from the warp, and in preparing for the anticipated events. Despite the integration of the Primaris, it seems that the Space Wolves feel that the end times are drawing nearer.